Okay, so good afternoon, good evening to everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with our session for today. And we have with us Mr. Quilian Riano. And I'll let him kind of reintroduce himself again. But of course, he's a part of the Dark Matter University group who presented to us at the beginning of the course. And so we're continuing with them in session with Mr. Riano this evening. So I'll turn it over to you, Quilian.
Hi, Roderick. Thank you so much. Again, it's such a pleasure to be here with you guys. It really is. I'm sure you very much enjoyed Jennifer's presentation last time. And I'm hoping to be able to have a little bit of a conversation also with you. So, if you remember more or less within our sequencing, it wasn't very hard borders that we were drawing on each other's practices or anything, but mine had a little bit more to do with a couple of things, including a more community-based practice, also the way that community design centers and the way that art institutions are increasingly working within community design and social practice, and there's 1,000 buzzwords and names for it. So that's a little bit what I'm gonna try to introduce to you today. So you may remember this from last time, so me, each of us with a slightly different kind of angle on basically the same set of concerns and ideas. Like I shared with you last time I came, I was born in Bogota, Colombia, where I lived until I was about 10 years old, and then I moved to the city of Hialeah. Then I went into the Air Force, where I served for 4 years, until I finished there and went to University of Florida, where I studied undergraduate architecture. Then I worked for Architecture 2030, and it's basically one of the biggest, honestly, experiences in a firm I've ever had. I'll go into that slightly, but I'll share some of that. And then I went to the GSD, and since then I've basically worked and trying to understand and look at what public means, what are publics, who designs for the public, and these set of questions. And I'm gonna emphasize both my practice work from my practice called Design Agency, which I lead. It used to employ people. These days I mostly just do collaboration, so usually it's just me and other firms kind of working together, peer-to-peer and in a collaborative manner, but less than having a full-on staff. Yeah, I'm sorry, the Graduate School of Design of Harvard University. And then what is a little bit about working with a community design center, what that is, I'm not sure if some of you. And then, just for a little bit of fun, I wanted to introduce you to some practices and idea and people that I enjoy looking at. I'm guessing that some of these are not going to be new to you, but I thought that it would be worthwhile still talking to you about a few people and just seeing where things go. Okay, so this is what I remember Hialeah, Florida being like. This is the highway here. This is the Sawgrass Expressway, and this is the mall parking lot, the canal that you really couldn't go into, the Office Depot, basically a built environment that was inhospitable, not really for humans, minimal sidewalks, and that kind of and really no places to gather. And this is my memory of Miami. Quite honestly, it might even be kind of the wrong memory at this point in time, but it really kind of imbued me with, as I began to go through architecture school, as I began to think about what my experience was with the built environment and its tenets, urbanism, architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture, and how those three things kind of had come in touch in my life in the US. So the first questions that I have for you is, How have you experienced the built environment up to now? And I'm happy to stop and take a couple of answers. And some of the questions I'm gonna be asking are just questions that I think that you should touch base with as you move forward through your educational career, because I bet that as you touch base and you come back and think about those questions, the answers might be a little bit different. So if anyone wants to share something about even the experience you have so far, if you can share what your experience with the built environment has been like. Feel free to talk, say it or put it in the chat.
I'd say up to this point. Oh, my name is Ruth Sapielis. I'm a fourth year architecture student. So yeah, I'll say up to this point, to be honest, I've never heard of the word built environment until like this year. And I'm like, where have this word been? But I think my mindset is shifting to more Black spaces for this semester. Like, how do I design, I'll say, for the Black culture, and how do I build that Afrocentric part of it to architecture instead of going very, I would say, Western, more of like Afrocentric. So I think that's where the direction that I'm going to now.
Thank you. Anyone else? I think that's a good point.
I was just going to jump in and say quickly, yeah, this terminology built environment, it's interesting because it's meant to be more broad than just architecture or landscape architecture or engineering or interior design, right? There are all these different ways that people design and build their environment. And so we tend to use that term built environment just to be as broad as possible. And it does include things like this sort of cultural dimension that you were just referring to. Like when we talk about Black spaces, you know, that exists within the built environment, or the experiences that people may have kind of reflecting their country of origin, for example, as they use a space. So, you know, this image is a parking lot, that's part of a built environment, but how that then gets used and kind of activated by people is also a part of our kind of environment, and how people are kind of building and shaping those spaces. So yeah, it's a cool term, right? You know, in Black Panther, when Hannah Beachler, the production designer, is kind of creating kind of worlds or imagination for how that society is sort of structured, that's also built environment, right? So they exist both in the real, but also kind of in our work as people that are creating spaces and creating experiences for people, are all built environment.
And thank you so much, Justin. And yeah, the word encompasses a lot, and it's broad on purpose. I hope that you take advantage of how broad it is to bring many things into your practice. And am I pronouncing your name correctly, Rutsa?
Yes.
Yeah, I really love the fact that you're bringing community into it, because my very kind of purpose of bringing this image is that it's so generic. And this was my feeling about the built environment until now, that it was just not a space for people, that it was a space for cars, in this case at least, and moved environments. But this really marked the way I thought about things. And then the next step for me was moving from Miami, Florida, from Bogota, which is about 7 million people, to Miami, which is about 3-4 million people, to South Dakota, that entire state has 200,000 people, maybe. Like, there are blocks in New York that are bigger than South Dakota. And I moved to this is Ellsworth Air Force Base. And here I spent 4 years. My job was to buy things and logistics. But really what an awakening came for me, kind of putting in context the generic nature of Miami, and quite honestly, this investment that I saw in the working class and low income community that I lived in. What happened the last year I was in the Air Force in around 2000 to 2001, a Red Horse team, which is our engineering kind of core, came to town and their National Guard duty was to build wells and some infrastructure in the Rosebud Reservation, a native reservation in the middle of the state. It kind of got me thinking, and then also that year also happened to have a professor, radical professor from the American Indian movement, an activist group that has existed for many years. South Dakota has probably one of the strongest, I mean, it happened everywhere, it's not a competition, but it did have a strong movement to not be colonized. Crazy Horse, this is where Crazy Horse defeated Custer, and there's a history there that is still remembered. And then because of that defeat, there was a massacre where they massacre women, children, just everyone. And that history is raw here. And it got me thinking about the politics, about what gets built, where and by whom, and for who does it benefit. And as I was thinking about this conversation, I also heard about an artist named Marietitza Potrich. And this is the moment in which I was beginning to go into, I had a scholarship waiting for me in Florida. And I was wondering whether I was going to go into architecture or art. And at this moment, I heard about this woman, Marietitza, and her work, she was an architect and an artist, and she had just gotten a prize at the Guggenheim. And what she decided to do is bring some of the work she had been doing in Latin America and put it in the Guggenheim. And now I have other sets of questions that I would probably ask about a work like this. But at the time, it made me realize that that architecture was a good place to begin to ask some really broader questions about the built environment, politics, who gets built what, and to take action within that context. Thank you. So a quick question for you guys. A couple of people can answer quickly. What has inspired you to go into architecture up to this point? Is there a specific thing you saw, or art or architect or piece of something that got you here?
I used to watch HGTV a lot, and that got me real interested in architecture.
Yeah, I feel like those shows have become even more popular in the last few years. So probably not something that was around when I was young and figuring this out. Anyone else?
Well, same, but I grew up drawing and watching buildings and just looking, and I just always had a feel for it.
Nice. So, you know, it's never too late. I would suggest, and this is one of the things I'm going to end with, is that you begin to look for, think about where you grew up, the things that you have seen, challenges, good things, etc. The idea of creating an Afrocentric or urban built environment, and take a look at some of the people that are working within that world. And these are the kind of inspirations are going to be very important as you move forward with your own work, and you begin to look at careers, etc. So I then went to University of Florida. My first professor there actually taught us watercolor, Bernard Wojciechowski. I'm guessing Justin may have known him. He also went to the same undergraduate as I did. We went to, I think he graduated a couple years before me, or the year I got there. So it was a very formal education. So I came in, again, wanting to do work like this. And the first kind of sets of things that I was confronted with was actually very formal work. And I was very happy about that, actually, because I kind of knew that I would always return to this, but learning how to create drawings that go beyond just telling you what's in the world, but allow you to analyze it, that was a tool that I was going to take for the rest of my life and be able to bring into any context that I wanted. So Bernard Wojciechowski was a hardcore, intense art professor that taught you how to make artwork. He didn't like your watercolor, he would rip it and kind of curse you out and make you do it again. And thankfully, people don't quite teach that way anymore. Very old school, but he was infamous for doing things like that. So I did a set of work and experiments throughout it of trying to bring literal people into pieces of architecture. Tell the stories. This was a skyscraper design with the stories of a hot dog vendor, a UN diplomat, and a tourist. This was a NOMA competition that we did in New York. This was a project for because in Italy they were outlawing immigrants from hanging out in public parks. So I created an entire project of housing immigrants in a public park. So it was projects that were searching to combine both a formal and a social language. And then at this point, I also discovered this book. This probably was one of the things that really kind of allowed me to see that there was another way of working that wasn't quite the thing that was happening when I was in school, which was looking at all the architects, Rem Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid, and all those people were the people getting the ink in the magazines. And I discovered this book by Walter Hood, a African-American landscape architect who was the director of the landscape architecture program at Berkeley for many years. And this was a fellowship he had received to work in Oakland. And looking at this book and looking at both the drawings and the way that people keep coming back and the patterns and the way that people actually live, not imaginations that erase people in order to place them, it really changed the way I thought, quite honestly. And it changed the way I design. I've constantly, I still use it as a reference. Dark Matter University is the first book I put in our library and share with everyone, because I think it's an incredibly important book that is undersung in its kind of power and design point of view, very thoughtful. Again, about working with what's there, not critically erasing because it's inconvenient. And making what's there beautiful. And then that has become something that I strive to do, can claim.
Sorry,
So
Quilian, you go back 1 second. I'm going to interject just one moment here. So this is something that I want all of you to really see this exposure. So Walter Hood is a Black male landscape architect. And he does these drawings, as Quilian mentioned, that are bringing his kind of perspectives and experiences as a designer and reflecting the types of communities that he's working within in his work as a designer, how he draws, how he has conversations with people about spaces, how he kind of works as a practitioner, as a designer, right, as a built environment designer. And something I want to know, like, this is probably the first time that most of you have ever heard of Walter Hood. You're like, okay, yeah, landscape architect. No, Walter Hood is someone that you all should know, right? Last year, Walter Hood won $1 million in prizes for being a great designer, right? MacArthur Grant, Gish Prize, and Knight Foundation Prize. So he's out there doing his work, spending time with people in community gardens, spending time with Black museums and institutions and community organizations, connecting with people and taking the values and interests and culture of Black people and making sure they're represented in space. And he's doing that as a designer, and he's doing it very well, and so well that people gave him $1 million. I just wanted to underline that you can be successful doing work that's authentic.
Thank you so much. That's such an important thing to say. It's an alternative way of working, a very kind of personal and authentic way, but one that, especially when it's as beautiful and poetic as Walter's, it really finds an audience. So yeah, I recommend it. I have had a chance to meet Walter, and I told him this story and how much he has meant to me, and fanboy a little bit. I got a little bit embarrassed. I think he was like, okay, cool. But it's one of those things. I also got a chance to meet Maria Titza Potrich and tell her that I had joined architecture. I was an architect kind of because of her, and she cried. So sometimes it's nice. But I took a little bit of a break. I've only worked for an architect 1 year of my life in a firm. I've only worked in a firm 1 year of my life, and it was for Edward Masria. Edward Masria was an architect in New Mexico, or is an architect in New Mexico. He retired about I don't know, 10 years, 15 years ago, whenever we started Architecture 2030. I worked in his firm. He is known as kind of like the godfather of sustainability in some ways. He wrote a book about how to design with the sun as the main driver for form making. So I got to work in Ed's office as he was closing it, designed a couple of buildings that got built. And then he was launching a nonprofit called Architecture 2030. And actually, to continue the thread that Justin started here about money, that there is kind of ways to work and be successful even in alternative ways. This is the most successful nonprofit in architecture. Millions of dollars go through it. And it's really a passion project for Ed to leave a better world behind. Where he's trying to, his point is that buildings are the #1 polluters in the world. That their use of energy, their use of materials, their use of all these things have created our major part of climate change. So he made a call urging and really challenging architects to bring down the way that the energy that their buildings use, and to do it through design as a design challenge. So for him, so I was literally the first employee, helped them strategize the whole thing, helped them when it was on the ground. It was just him and me. And one of the things that I learned is how to make change, because Ed both had a track record and a network and a way of working that was very action oriented. So I learned that from him. And then I got to build this thing for him. This is a 2030 palette, and it exists as a website, 2030palette.org, that gives architects rules of thumb on how to design with the environment and what those designs could look like, how they have looked like in many cultures throughout history, and various examples. And then with his expertise specifically on passive solar energy, we did some deep dives into it. So this is a project I did. So I began to broaden my practice to include the strategic and kind of educational design, really, above it. Then I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Design. While here, I'm going to share with you something that probably changed my career in more ways than I might even imagine, which is that I started a blog on ArchiNet. I have always been kind of, I like to talk, maybe. I like to debate. And when I was younger, probably did it more and more effectively than I do it now. So I started a blog that ended up being incredibly popular. And like, it would change conversations we were having within the GSD. So this is just a way to urge you to also include a writing of practice within your own practice of design. That thinking and making go hand in hand. To not worry about what other people are gonna think about what you write, to put your thoughts out there. And I can bet that you guys are experts on the places that you come from and certain sets of ideas and ways of working in a way that other people are not. And like anything else, writing is practice. So the more you do it, the better you're gonna get at it, and the more you're gonna get distilled to the issues that you really care most about. So this is an urging to not leave your practice at the door. So here I did projects like, did architecture, and this was a project we did in Chinatown, an activist project. Chinatown in Boston had not had a library, is the only neighborhood in Boston without one. So we created a pop-up library using automated tools and CAD/CAM and all that thing. Because of the visibility guide, they actually secured money for a library. It's also when I got more interested into landscape architecture. Again, I had known about Walter Hood, but his landscape architecture, quite honestly, is very different than most, than other ways of doing landscape architecture, or at the very least. So, but beginning to think about our architecture at the scales of landscapes was also very helpful. And then I met another one of the people that kind of changed my career, friend, mentor, Teddy Cruz. Teddy Cruz is well known for, he's a professor at the University of California in San Diego, UCSD, and he actually works in art and architecture. He's officially a professor of art. in UCSD. And he has been working in the border between San Diego and Tijuana for many decades. And the arguments he makes, he's both a great argument, he makes great arguments, and he creates narratives and stories about things in a way that really are compelling, and then he can back it up with some great imagery. So this is a set of housing units built using pieces from maquiladoras. These are the factories in Tijuana that most people come from all over Latin America to work in. And he was making an argument about how the two sides, the US and Mexico, could work together, etc. This led to my thesis. So again, writing and making kind of stories about frames and infills, looking at practices like Alejandro Aravena's Elemental in Chile, looking at art. Again, to me, art theory is very important. I feel like art is light years ahead of architecture and social practices in theorizing and being able to create social practice. So I've always looked to that. My final project ended up being a housing project in Tijuana, in which this gigantic roof would collect water in a place with no, basically design an entire project in a desert that's all about water. Understanding and looking at the history of people that live in deserts, like in Northern Africa and Spain and the Middle East, that when you don't have water, you design for water. So design entire things around water, including both very pragmatic things, but also moments of beauty and recreation. So the next step for me was to envision a new kind of practice. I came to a moment. It also happened that I graduated right around the last recession. So whether I would go into a practice, go on a practice by myself, actually, thankfully, because I'm a veteran, I have a healthcare for life. So that actually allowed me to make the decision to go into my own practice. I didn't need health insurance. Again, these things are realities that we live with in the US in ways that other countries don't. And that changed lives. You know, sometimes just the need for health insurance forces you to make a set of decisions. But thankfully, I was able to start and think about that. And this is a question I'm going to begin to pose to you and to think about as you go through your education. What kind of practice do you envision? You might not be able to start it right after school. It might take a while. But it's always good in your mind to think about what is the kind of work, how is the kind of process, what kind of clients, all those kind of things that I want to do. So the first forays that I actually started working with a friend of mine, DK Oseo, who's a Ghanaian American. He and I ended up splitting up because he was mostly in Africa and it just wasn't working together. But the first thing we did is we got a grant to go to Colombia, actually to my native, my family's native city of Facatativá, to do some social housing. And we got a grant from the Boston Society of Architects. And here what we were trying to look at is the typology of the housing and trying to re-envision to create collective areas for building, for growing, for creating micro businesses. And then something happened. I moved to New York City right at the time. Like I moved a little bit of like a year before, but right as Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street was beginning to happen. So these conversations around politics and the way that our cities are built and who they're for and why they're built became more important. So one of the first things I did was create a collective called Who Owns Space that looked at the increasing privatization of public space and what that could mean for the future of public space. So again, to go back to ideas around Afrocentric urbanism, how does a business improvement district help or hinder that ideal? There are sets of policies on the ground that really box us in many ways. But then again, business improvement districts don't have any given structure. You can work them however you want. But it's all about understanding them to be able to play with them. So I got into the ideas of designing policies and being able to play within them as a way of working. So we did a set of, one of the things I did with Who Owns Spaces, I brought together planners, lawyers, architects, designers. We did everything from maps and tours of different privately owned public spaces to actually suing the city at one point to show us to show us the permits for some renovations that were being claimed. Hello? Okay. So that got me to working with the Queens Museum of Art, perhaps one of the institutions that began to pioneer the idea of social practice, that artists, architects, designers, embedded in communities and work in community processes can have an aesthetic and a design value. And they asked me to look at a plaza called Corona Plaza. The first thing I did was a series of signs that I call lo-fi augmented reality that allowed people to see both to diagram some of the issues, some of the challenges, and to pose questions. In a way, I always called it that, you know, like if I had a residential client that I would get to know what their everyday patterns, right? Like I would go and get to know how they cook, where the kind of life they live. And that one way to do that is to actually get to know the community by asking these sets of questions and creating situations that are slightly weird. This was a little bit weird, putting a bunch of plexiglass signs, and then put people that spoke Spanish and English. This is in Corona, Queens, a place that's heavily Latino. It actually, this plaza itself is the #1 place for Latinos to be stopped and frisked when that was happening. For African-American men, that happened mostly in the Bronx and Brooklyn. But so there were sets of challenges and complications. At this time, I also got into ideas around gaming and into theater of the oppressed, a theater that asks us to role play and think about the oppression that we face every day and to role play solutions or ideas to confront that oppression. So instead, my next step was to take the information that I learned through those signs and create a game out of it. I took the things that I heard most often that people wanted social services. The embassies would like the Mexican and Ecuadorian embassy would set up here because a lot of people are undocumented and they couldn't, they work, they pay taxes, but they couldn't get any social services. So the embassies of their countries actually are stepping in places where other social infrastructure isn't. Green spaces, mobility, local economies. There's a lady with tamales in the corner always, completely, again, extra legal, but everyone loves their tamales there. And community programming, everyone wanted to show off the things that the kids did. So for each one of these items, so it was 5 pieces, created 3 pieces for each of the items, but the board itself only had 12 little areas where you could put them. So through a series of facilitation and a series of prompts, people, so this is what it looked like. People would tell us how to move them around. And the goal here was not to win. It's not a game that you win or lose. It's a game in which that exposes conversations, potential conflicts. It allows for negotiation of public space. So this is what I gave the museum, a series of these vignettes that combine some of the spatial ideas that were coming up, as well as the notes. So this was, and then I did some other designs, but my job was to go up to this point. Then because the Department of Transportation had already hired a landscape architect to take these ideas and do something with them. I wanted to show you a little bit more of this kind of gaming idea. This was for a project in Nicaragua. This was a collaboration with Studio Teddy Cruz. So again, my friend and mentor, a nonprofit in Nicaragua reached out to us and they wanted us to, they were building these little houses that were kind of no light, very, not very good building, to be honest. So they were asking us to build, to help them create a plan for 80 houses in a very, very low income community. That they would be built by the community itself. But although many people here work in construction, especially in Costa Rica, they go as undocumented workers to Costa Rica, they couldn't read drawings, architectural drawings and urban design drawings. So what I decided to do is to create a game out of the planning by putting a line down the middle and then moving that line so many times and then creating these kind of sets and then asking people, because we didn't have good landscape plans either, to map out where the trees were and then to slide the houses in and out according to where the trees were. The trees being important, both food source and also an economic engine. And here you can see some of the results. And by the way, for this project, the very first thing we did is help this community create a business plan for a construction company. And we got them a tractor shipped up there because the road would collapse every time it rained and the city wouldn't fix it. It was to the point that this community started renting out its tractor to the city hall. So we really kind of rearranged, we helped this community. They told us what they needed. The first thing wasn't housing, the first thing was a tractor. So we did that first. And we kind of flipped around the power dynamic with the nearby city. And this is what the houses ended up looking like. You know, they had more light, they had room to grow, they had more flexibility. And I love this picture because it shows the tree right next to the house, so that this kind of game-like planning system paid some dividends. Similarly, this was a little pavilion I designed for Dallas. It was a conversation around the future of the southwestern city. It was in the neighborhood of Dallas, and they asked me to make a pavilion, and I decided to create a game in which this back here, this black mesh, collects, is a dew catcher, so passively overnight it collects water and brings it down to these metal troughs here, and then the kids have extra pieces of wood that they can use to bring into the main sandlot and negotiate land and water. And you know, without being super didactic about it, that was the point. The future of southwestern city is to negotiate land and water. There's not enough water, the land is limited. How do we do this? And some incentives for collectivizing. Another quick project I'm going to show you. I think I'm going to start speeding it up. Yeah, I'm going to start speeding it up a little bit. This was in South Phoenix. Groups representing Black and brown farmers in a community that was a food desert came together, and they were building a farm in a site that was bigger than about 5 New York City blocks. Maybe I'm exaggerating, it was like 3, but it was just a gigantic site. And you can see it's desert. So they asked me to do a master plan for them, and so I worked with them to create one. And they're currently using it, the major community garden here with the rest, and a farming incubator where people can take on gigantic lots and try to become actual farmers and sell at scale. And then they asked me to design the first set of public buildings, including an idea from the Dallas piece, a pavilion that would combine dew catching with water misters for very hot days. So this is a quick project. Again, everything from community engagement to organizing, working with nonprofits and organizing that, and then creating a major piece of design that then would serve that community. Next, I'm going to show you very quickly. And again, you can see, and that farm was financed by the Desert Botanical Garden. One of the most foo-foo, I don't know, upper end institutions in Phoenix that saw the need to work with communities of color, and they hire a community organizer that helped set up the entire thing. And in this case, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Virginia's Commonwealth University was creating spaces for political conversations, what it means to be in a Commonwealth. So I worked with a couple architects, one called Carlos Medellin, the other one Giancarlo Massanti. Giancarlo Massanti is perhaps the best architect in Latin America. He works for Shakira. Like Shakira gives him money to like build things. And we designed an incredibly flexible space to have a set of conversations all over and of different sizes. Flexibility, the idea that collectivizing means having flexibilities of spaces. And so you can see some of the ideas, the translucency, colors, the way that these would function, the way they would open up, and the way that they would allow even for parties. This is what it looked like. And I was very happy because out of this gentleman right here with the dreadlocks, Duran Chavez, is an urban farmer and activist. So this year they asked Duran to build an active urban farm because he's built over 300 growing beds in Richmond, and he's truly a dynamo and yeah, a community activist and a doer, like that you just love to see. Then they asked him to design this farm, and they asked me if I would help design, give some design guidelines and some design ideas. So similarly to the project we did in Nicaragua, I created a very loose structural logic, and his idea was to put also a gigantic a mural that would say Black Space Matters. And the space itself then becomes a place for literally the space where it says space becomes a place for community gathering and conversations about what that space is and how it can grow, and the investments and the things that the African American community needs in Richmond to make Black space matter. He also, in these growing tables that he built here, so in the growing beds, the same muralist that designed the Black Space Matters, the graffiti all over them. But then in the tables, he has a whole history of urban farming by African Americans as a liberative model. He's very much very knowledgeable about that. The last quick project that I'll show is this. And this is an under the elevated space. This is in Sunset Park. This was a project in which I was selected as the urban designer. I worked with a landscape architect, Tricia Martin, and a lighting designer named Lenny Schwendinger. Lenny is the coolest designer I've ever met. She calls herself a rock star, a lighting designer, and I agree, she is. And together we built, this was, a dreary space and behind what's basically, this is one of the oldest highways in the United States, the Gowanus Expressway, and in the BQE. And you can see also that it's old because how beautiful the structure is. It's not a typical highway. But at this point, it was basically just free parking and a dangerous place to cross. And it has just seen better days. Even the water spout was placed in a way that it would just dump on the people crossing the street. I've never seen anything quite like that. So together we worked on designing something. And what's interesting about this too is that it teaches you how often when you take on projects, especially public projects in which communities of color are involved, sometimes you have to slow down the process. The idea was to design something a lot faster. But when we came there, we understood that the community itself was concerned. Gentrification, there's mostly a Mexican community with some patches of Puerto Rican. It used to be bigger, more Puerto Rican back in the day. But one of the concerns here is that it's quickly gentrifying, as a lot of New York City is. So the community basically didn't want us there, or at least parts of the community didn't want us there. And they were scared about what this meant, that building this, making good design or beautiful or anything, and not that this is any of those things, that this is a pilot project for a public agency. It's a little bit pragmatic too. But that any improvements was a sign that it was not for the people that are there, that is quite honestly for the rich white people that are gonna move in. We took that very seriously. We slowed down the process. We brought the community, created a community advisory board that truly represented the community. And we began to teach a green infrastructure class at the high school, so that the high school students would also get involved. So a project that I think at first was supposed to take about 6 months ended up taking about 2 years. Not because of it's complicated, but because we wanted to consciously slow down the process to bring people to the table and have a conversation about this. The first thing they told us, they didn't want coffee shops, food trucks. They didn't want the tropes of that have become urban design. They wanted safe places to get to work. That's it. So we took that seriously and created productive spaces. Spaces that move water, move people, that work underwater, cleaning it before it reaches the bay. So we took that seriously and we tried to be conscious of it. And, you know, the lighting is functional in that it's grow lights that help the plants grow. By lighting it, becomes a lantern in the community. And they have this thing, again, 3rd Avenue is basically a highway in this moment to slow down. And I'm very happy. So this, what I like to call a ridiculous scupper here, the ridiculous downspout, actually was something I was designing for the Phoenix project. I was a series of dew catchers that would look more or less like that. I grabbed them from my model and put them in Sunset Park, remodeled it, made it more of a downspout. And I kind of, but I think myself and a lot of people responded to it because all of a sudden it became big and a little bit ridiculous, not the kind of thing you would see in a pragmatic system, but it celebrates the movement of urban water. So anyway, just a little bit of an example. And then it became this L-Space toolkit. I know Justin also had a strong hand in ushering this through New York City. But it's something now that the Department of Transportation uses. So you can see the 3 things we did very clearly here. Number 1 is create a way for water to move, water to fall into these 2 big green infrastructure pieces that will clean the water and allow it to both move slower into the ground and cleaner. Lighting the thing so that is both helps the plants grow, but it also slows cars down. And then creating a pedestrian system that organizes the parking and creates safety. So I know I might be running out of time a little bit, so I'll go a little bit faster. I have only a few more. How do we come together with others? This has been a big part of my practice. You probably have heard me raise words like cooperatizing multiple times, collectivizing. So I joined a group started by Peggy Deemer. She used to be a dean, assistant dean of Yale's architecture school. In the architecture lobby, a group that brings architects and designers together to advocate for their needs as workers, not just as designers. Not the fact that we need to build more things, and we all need to build more things. We all want a bigger piece of the pie. But that we also have healthcare needs, we have daycare needs, that sometimes women don't get the same treatment, people of color don't get the same treatment in the workplace. So we put together a 10-point manifesto that started around 2012, 2013, now has chapters all over the country, many schools. It's a major organization, is one of the organizations planning the Green New Deal within architecture and urban design. And now we're also beginning to create a cooperative network to let small design firms join a bigger structure that would hopefully help them take care of some administrative tasks, will help them move around employees, will help them get bigger projects by collectivizing. So for anyone interested, the Architecture Lobby, Dark Matter University itself has been one of the most beautiful things, pieces of organizing and collectivizing I've ever seen. It's really been a wonderful experience to join people like Justin, Jerome, Jennifer, Vanessa, and the many other people that haven't even really, that you haven't seen, but there's over 50 people in the DMU collective. And there's 2 things about DMU. I've never seen a group come together so fast, take action so quickly, and generally do it in consensus without major disagreements or negotiations needing to take place. And so it's been just, and not only is it good because of the actions it's taken, but it really has created a community where we all knew each other in many ways, but I feel now like we're a community in a way that we weren't before. And again, sometimes challenges that are as big as the ones we're facing require this level of organizing. None of us individually can solve them all. Okay, so how to work for the public good. You're gonna hear later on from Justin specifically how to work within government, a lot more than I can say. I work for the Department of Design and Construction. I'm not gonna share too much about that, except to say that I've done that within government too. Justin has a lot more experience with that, so I'll leave that to him. But I'm gonna share with you that in my practice, I began to do more things. This is for the National Park Service. They were putting a park in Colesville, where in Hartford, Connecticut, in an African-American Puerto Rican community, which houses the original factory where they invented the Colt 45, the weapons, Colts. So in a community with gun violence, they were going to put, or they are going to put some still, and the idea, as National Park Service begins to go into more urban areas to create national parks, they wanted to begin to rethink the way they do that. Within government itself, sometimes it's hard. So what they did is they asked Van Allen Institute, and the Van Allen Institute asked me to put together a team that would do it. I brought together journalists, oral historians, artists. Areola here is one of the most amazing artists, Areola and Nick Boken. You'll ever meet, one of the most critical and sharp-eyed designers I have ever worked with, as well as a couple architects, Joyce Huang, and what we did is, again, slow down the process, because again, what they wanted was a quick sketch of what they could do in front of the park to kind of signal at the community. And we said, no, that's not really what we think should happen here. So we created a series of community engagement events. But we were, to be honest, contracted for so little. It wasn't a huge contract. It wasn't, we all have to work, right? So what we decided to do is, as well as we were doing the work, to also bring in the National Park Service staff so that they could continue to facilitate these kind of processes for the long run. And we collected information of the kind of things that the community wanted to do. And then we created a set of maps along specific topics that showed people, and then we created the tools for the National Park Service itself to continue that, or to hire designers to implement these sets of engagements that then would lead to design. So again, sadly, my job and sometimes is to tell people that we're not ready for design, and people don't always love to hear it. But quite honestly, the community sometimes is the best. So then I went to Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative. The Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative is a community design center. And I wanted to throw this out. I think everyone, this is a free book online, Activist Architect by Dan Pitera and Craig L. Wilkins. I recommend everyone go and download it. I can put the link later on. I'll try to finish here pretty quickly. And these are the major forms: a pro bono arm of a firm, a nonprofit design firm, or the university-based design center. I am in a university-based design center. I work really for Kent State University, but I work in a unit that is basically a firm within it that its goal and mission and vision is to work with communities. So just very quickly, and because of who you are, it allows you to take on projects that other firms wouldn't, and even, or if other projects that other firms would, to think about them in new ways and different ways, and more, again, through a community purpose. So we got an American Roundtable, and we're looking at the Mahoning Valley. The Mahoning Valley is Youngstown, Ohio to Warren, Ohio, through the Mahoning River. And we were looking at the future of work in an area that used to look like this with steel mills. This was the river diverted to cool down the steel. It has lost all these jobs. It has a set of challenges that are big, including racial inequality, that at one point was better than it is now because of the unions and the work opportunities that were in the area. As less opportunities, the segregation has become more intense. And working with Matt Martin, who runs the Trumbull Neighborhood Partnership, and then looking at examples like this one. He was hiring a lot of contractors that didn't look like the community to do work that he thought the community could do, So he began to create construction crews that would recruit and work with from the community and keep people in the community. So now we're also working on a federal grant to reimagine the Lordstown GM plant and what it could be in the future. It's going to include recommendations to do projects like this as well as identifying a set of spaces. This is the new electric truck company that has gone to the Lordstown plant. It used to be a GM plant. But also to think about sites like this, that steel mill I showed you before, this is what they look like now. And what can happen here looking at the future. The same as the Golden Triangle, which is one of the oldest one of the first cars in the United States was built here, the Packard in the 1890s. So I've run also studios. This is a studio looking at the future of work where students did everything from pipelines to women incubators to green factories that embed into the landscape. And super quickly, I'm gonna share with you a few practices that I'm inspired by, that I look to for ideas and ways of working. Theaster Gates in Southside Chicago. Tony Griffin and her work around the Just City Lab at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. She's a planner. She and I have had a chance to work on a few times together, and just another friend, a mentor. Rick Lowe and his work, and he's more of an artist, but his work building communities in Houston. Santiago Cirujeda, a Spanish architect that looks at laws that don't allow him to do certain things that the community needs and creates funny hacks to those laws. So in the most famous case that I should have put that one is that there was a community with no playgrounds, a historic kind of downtown Spanish city, but still not very rich or anything. So what he did is bring construction dumpsters and turn those into playgrounds because those were allowed. So kind of funny things like that he does. Assemble in the UK, where this was an abandoned or empty gas station that they turn into theaters and to public spaces to turn something that could become derelict into active uses for communities. I never know if it's La Mas or LA Mas. I think both work, but a collective that actually during COVID has become about direct action, understanding the needs of the community and filling them, but they're more known for this kind of colorful urban design and community work. Chad Travieso, an architect and artist that has been creating 2 sets of projects working with Black and brown young people in the Bronx, working on a project called Yes Loitering, in which he with teenagers, he talks about what it means to not be allowed to be in many places, the no loitering signs, and how to challenge that kind of thing. He's been looking at segregation lines, and especially in South Florida and other southern cities, and has been building these kind of things. Okay, that's it for me. I hope I didn't throw too much at you, but I did want to throw enough that is worthwhile. Yeah, we can have some questions.
That was great. Thank you for that presentation.
I have like a quick question, but before that, I just want to thank you for the presentation. You had amazing graphics. I want to be like you when I grow up. But one thing I want to know is how did your military or army background, did it ever tie into architecture? And if so, how?
I directly, maybe not, but what the military taught me is things like logistics. Before, my job was to buy things. So my job in the military was to purchase, to understand systems and where things were going. And I think that that has been a helpful kind of tool. Directly, probably not much more than that, but you know, the kind of things that I think the military always gives you, which is a certain amount of organization and stick-to-itiveness, that kind of thing. And like I'm telling you, I don't sleep on that on that socialized healthcare, because I gotta tell you, it opened up my possibilities. The fact that I can go to the VA in any city really then opens up things. But so in that way, because my job was more logistical and more kind of purchasing. So not directly, but obviously the histories, the experiences I had in South Dakota, the things I saw, the narrative I was trying to create is that it has stayed with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I
And I want to
another
be like you when I grow up.
Thank you. I have another question. So most of your work, where did they take place? Where exactly did you work more?
Probably New York City, and probably the community of Jackson Heights and North Corona. I've taught at least 5 studios there. I've done deep dives in that area. At one point, I knew all the kind of players, the community groups, and that kind of thing. So probably New York City. Besides that, it has been a really national practice. Before moving to Ohio, I have only moved to Ohio. I mean, I'm talking to you from Shaker Heights, Ohio, about a year ago. Before that, I was in Brooklyn. I had projects in Latin America and Africa. I've done projects in Venice and in Europe, all around looking at immigration, diversity, how we can live in a diverse city and in places, for example, although we can use big words like immigrants, but Jackson Heights, this Roosevelt Avenue place that I've talked about, every single street corner, the nationality changes. So there's little Colombia, there's the little Philippines, the little Thailand, little Nepal, and there's a big LGBTQ community, big trans community. And yet it's one of the most politically active and successful communities in the country. They defeated a business improvement district they didn't want. They defeated a soccer stadium they didn't want. Is where AOC came out of. And it's also a place where they have organized to increase the amount of public space and to even buy up a private school and turn it into public space. So I see it as an example of a democratic model that really recognizes that we don't have to share the same set of signifiers, subjectivities, whatever we want to call it, in order to work together for a political purpose. And my question has been, how does that turn into an architecture and urban design?
Any other questions or comments?
I had just a follow up, because you were talking about some of your organizing, and within one of the conversations you said that your conclusion was that they weren't ready for design. And could you maybe talk a little bit more about that, like what you meant, and then what were maybe some steps that maybe you would maybe follow to kind of get a group ready for a design engagement?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because I feel like that's also something that Dark Matter University is beginning to do quite a bit of. Even we did a call for curriculum and classes lately, and there were a couple of classes on this question on how to slow down processes and see slowing down as a value. Because one of my experiences, I'm going to share with you my experience, which is that, especially because I worked a lot in New York. In a moment, I'm not sure exactly where New York is going. I don't think too many people know exactly where it's going post-COVID and post this moment in time. But about a year ago, 2 years ago, what I saw was a fear everywhere, especially in communities of color, Black communities, brown communities, that anything that had the word design on it was not for them. And that it was something that was coming to take their place. It was just basically a cleanup effort. And quite honestly, I can't blame them because I understand that. I understand it, and I saw the process. I lived in an area that when I first moved there, it had a much bigger Puerto Rican community than it did when I left. Bed-Stuy, I saw in the 10 years I lived in New York City, I saw major changes. It wasn't that long, but still. And some people say, well, change is normal. I agree. As an immigrant to a country and as someone that I am change, I have to believe that it's good. But I think agency and change, that you have a certain amount of control over how things change is also important. And that's what I feel like Black and Brown communities often lack, is that the structural power that would allow it. So and this has happened in multiple projects where I come into it, and I have to be honest, sometimes I'm brought in because I'm a person of color and because I can speak Spanish in a place where they're working. And it's funny because I don't even really realize it until it happens. I'm like, oh, okay. But that's not enough. That my body and my representation there is not enough to whitewash something that is not okay. So often I have to come in and tell people, look, we can't do this. Everyone, when they hear you're a designer, you hear an architectural designer, urban designer, they want you to do a sketch that shows them where the benches go, where the overheads go, and that they're gonna be cool, and that people are, and that they have maybe something like that harkens back to the community, maybe something with a Puerto Rican theme, or maybe something that harkens to, I don't know, something, the kind of, I forgot the radial kind of designs, maybe in Africa or something like that. And you have to say, no, that's not what I do. You have to tell them, look, we're gonna have to stop this process, really hear people out, understand what they need. And you as an institution have to be willing to understand that design in this moment might mean something completely else, different. It might be the design of a process that can get us to a set of things. Maybe your national park, you know, at the end of the day, I know you're gonna put exhibitions that talk about the Code 45, right? I mean, it's Codesville. But maybe you also need to understand that the National Park Service maybe needs to create spaces and places for the communities affected by gun violence to have conversations. That maybe the original framing is not quite the right one, and because quite honestly, not often the people that are both from that neighborhood or even that could maybe think about some of the things that that community could think about are at the table. And in Sunset Park was another place that was clear that we needed to work slower. And I feel because we did, the project was more successful. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Could we get maybe at least one more question before we wrap up today from a student?
I have one.
Yes.
What would you say would be your most difficult project?
Difficult project. I'm trying to think. I usually do have an answer for that, but I forgot because there have been places, I mean, there have been times when I've done tons of work and haven't gotten paid, where I have gotten into a situation. Okay, I remember what I usually say to this question, which is, it's not difficult, but it gets you a little bit into interesting situations. When you start becoming an architect or a designer that gets into places of controversy, like the business improvement district, you end up creating sometimes spaces where that are both one of the reasons why architects are great at coming in to this projects is because we can kind of create wrinkles in long-term kind of fault lines in community, and maybe there's two groups that are fighting, and we can say, what about if we think about it that way? But that also, so for example, an urban design studio I taught, looking at the business improvement district, looking at its history. And again, I'm kind of fascinated by these sets of policies created mostly during white flight in the 60s, 50s, 60s, to combat, to basically compete with the suburbs. But we're ended up creating systems that at times are just unjust. I mean, the business improvement district was really a way to compete with the mall. It allows an urban area to tax itself, create its own branding, put a security guard, pick up its own garbage. But then they can also create a set of rules that, for example, might keep street vendors out in an area full of street vendors. Like, again, this area in Corona. So I did a study that looked at its history. They started in Toronto, which was interesting for me to think about because I always thought of them as a more American and New York thing, but no, it was in Toronto. And to begin to get into the minutia, how they work, what they do, potential ways in which they could work differently, and how we might not need them at all, and create community processes that do it. So we taught a studio, my students and I worked, and then the final review was probably one of the most interesting and difficult things because we had both the activists fighting against the bid and the bid director in the same room. And both of them happy and unhappy with the things we were doing. So it's something that I've become a little bit more accustomed to, which is that when you get embroiled in these bigger conversations that quite honestly, I think they're worthwhile, us as designers with our particular points of view and sets of tools and skills, we can get ourselves into places where we might be shouted at in ways that we wouldn't otherwise. And it has happened a time or two. I think that I've become comfortable with a certain amount of productive, negotiable conflict. And I see it as a productive place to have robust conversations. I see it as a democratic imperative. In a democracy, we should have different opinions and we should come ready to talk about them, right? But that's probably one of the most interesting kind of sets. The other ones are about, because of the clients I work with, sometimes I have to help them fundraise. That can be difficult. Sometimes we have to push, we really want this piece to go up now, but we just don't have the money. So I have to create facing diagrams that allow us to do the thing we can do it in 5 days, in 5 weeks, in 5 years. So there are some sets like that, but yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simone.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being here today, and I want to thank Professor Riano for leading us and for great work that he has done and is doing, and also for Professor Moore and Professor Hayford, who's joined us, is going to, I think, will be with us next week. So again, just want to remind you that your reflection assignment will be due, that's due now tomorrow. So we want you to kind of do these kind of quickly before you forget. So, and I should be posting a video sometime either this evening or early tomorrow morning, but then we'd like you to have those completed and uploaded for Wednesday. All right?
And Roderick, would you like also the PDF of the presentation?
Yes, that'd be great. Because I think part of the interesting thing about all the presentations really is just how effective you are at capturing the theme of what you're describing and the way that it's mapped or diagrammed, or so I think it's very illustrative, not only to reinforce your presentation, but also as examples of the kind of graphics that I think students will want to produce. Perfect.
I'll get you that right away. Thank you, Roderick. And thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. This means a lot to us to present to you. Samuel, you had a question?
Oh, yes. I asked, can I talk to you properly? Because you said you did logistics. It's when you was in the Air Force. That's what I plan on doing.
You plan on going into logistics?
No, I'm majoring in architecture. And you said, instead of doing architecture, you're doing logistics in the Air Force.
Architectures and logistics. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing you.
Yeah, I have my mask on beside the store.
Uh,
If I thought I heard him correctly, it sounded like he's saying he's going into the Air Force.
okay. Architecture itself in the Air Force is probably more within an engineering field, not logistics. Because again, I was in the Air Force before architecture. I went in when I was 17 years old. I was a child soldier.
I think what he's trying to say is he's going into logistics in the Air Force. And he wanted to speak to you privately about that.
Oh yeah, perfect. Yeah, I was in the logistics squad, logistics group, and the contracting squadron. It was funny because in the Air Force I was actually an officer by title, but not by rank. Because by rank I had no rank. I was an airman. But just the nature of the job of having to spend the taxpayers' dollars, they have to give you the officer title.
And thank you, Kasim. And I think maybe what I'll do, if it's okay, Quilian, is I'll share your email with Samuel.
Oh yeah, please.
He can
I always love to talk about the Air Force. I'm gonna be honest with you, it's been 20 years. So it's not super, I don't always remember everything, but I'll be happy to share with you. You probably go in as an officer, which is always an added plus. And I'll share with you some of the things that I know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. And we'll—
Great talk, Quilian.
Thanks so much, Jerome.
Yeah, it was great. And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Jerome.
Thank you for the presentation.
Bye-bye.